This is Chapter 7, a review of the workforce. So let's start by defining different types of workers. So there's some general classifications, which include professionals, supervisory personnel, and then we have skilled and unskilled workers. So let's start with the professionals and define who those individuals are. So these are people who have extensive formal education in a field, and they've acquired the knowledge and skills really to make some sort of judgments independently and to function in that field with very little supervision. Professionals typically are thought to prefer participative or rather than autocratic management. So they like to be involved in the decision-making process. Entry-level professionals are at the very beginning of their careers. They probably have basic baseline knowledge of the job that they're doing, but they have very limited actual experience in the field. So if you want to think of an example of like an entry-level dietitian, it could be an example of that. And then there is some specialization that can occur within that profession, which means they've narrowed to a very specific area of the profession. So example here could be renal dietitian, or this could be a sports dietitian. Supervisors are usually individuals with authority to oversee and direct the work of those who report to them or subordinates, and have responsibility, for their own work. So they're usually the ones that are overseen, and they have a variety of people who report to them. These could be professionals as well. Skilled workers are individuals who have special training or skills to perform a very specific job. Think of a cook or a secretary. These types of jobs usually take more than 30 days to learn, and they don't usually need to be micromanaged. Right? So providing intensive supervision, constantly checking in, verifying progress. What a lot of people who are in higher level positions can't stand being micromanaged, right? Just let me do my job. I know what I'm doing. Skilled workers are like that. They know what they're doing. They don't need a lot of oversight typically, and they don't need to have constant intensive checking in on. Unskilled workers are those who bring no marketable skills per se to the job, but they're OJT, right? They are trained on the job. They've got some potential. They've got, basic skills, but they don't necessarily know exactly what it is that they are been required to do. So there's a lot of training involved here. Job tasks can be learned in the work setting in 30 days usually or less. A lot of times, well, I shouldn't say a lot, in some cases, unskilled workers may resist participative management, and they would rather just be told what to do. They don't want to be involved in the decision-making process. They just want, give me directions and I will execute those directions. Not for everybody, but in some cases this is true. There are different types of employment status, as you probably are familiar with if you've ever held a job. Depending on what it is that you're doing, you could have full-time, part-time, short hour, or casual. We'll talk about each of those. You probably are familiar with the first two, maybe not necessarily the second two on this slide. So let's start with full-time. This is the one that a certain number of hours a week are considered full-time. This is usually 40 hours. In some cases, it might be 37 and a half. I've even seen 36 hours be considered full-time. Typically, it consists of 5 8-hour days. I know, though, a lot of organizations that are going to 4-10s, where you have a 3-day weekend, so either Friday or Monday off. So I know that, it varies, but typically it's within that realm of 40 hours. A part-time worker is one who works a predetermined number of hours, but is less than what you would consider full-time. A lot of times this is 30 hours or 20 hours. Usually they're guaranteed a number of hours each week if you're a part-time employee. I know a lot of students who work part-time and go to school full-time. And they are usually working in the general area of 20 hours a week, but it can be less than that, or it could be more. Could be even up to 32 hours a week could still be considered part-time in some cases. A short hour worker is one who works a predetermined number of hours each week, but it's less than half time. Typically, half time is 20 hours a week, so it might be less than that. It might be 10 hours a week or 5 hours a week, something to that effect. Casual workers are not guaranteed any kind of set number of hours, and they're scheduled to work as they are needed. They gain experience in their positions, so they may become eligible for positions as they come up, whether they're part-time or full-time. They might be just on call kind of positions or PRN. Employment status. There's some categories that you need to be aware of when it relates to employment status. So we'll talk about job sharing, probationary or at-will employees, career workers, and then we'll talk a little bit about contingent workers. So job sharings become more popular where two individuals work in tandem to perform one full-time job. Usually they're coming in on off times, so one might work Monday, Wednesday, other one may work Tuesday, Thursday. Advantages here, you obviously have increased talent and skills and ideas. You have more than one person working on that position that might have they have a little bit different skill sets potentially that they're bringing to the table. Disadvantages could include increased time need for communication, potential decreased productivity and lack of continuity. If you have people jumping in and doing job differently, it could create some confusion of where one task was left off. It really kind of depends on the individuals in these roles and how well they communicate with one another. Probationary workers refer to newly hired people who have not yet demonstrated the ability to do the job. They're usually given a set period of time to learn it, and then at that point in time they're determined whether or not they can be dismissed without cause or they're kept on in that position. Usually probation's 60 to 90 days. To kind of give them enough time to get a feel for what they should be doing, learn the skills needed, and then given the time to do that. Employment status. An at-will employee who is one who can be terminated at any time for any reason with a requirement from a formal progressive discipline process. So a lot of times I was an at-will employee in a government organization, so I work for ADE. Essentially, it just means that they can let you go at any time without cause, but you can then request a hearing or, to get some feedback as to why they dismissed you for no reason. So it gives you, the employee, a little bit more opportunity to inquire and to push back, but it really gives the organization opportunity to dismiss an employee that they may or may not have documentation about. Temporary workers are those who are hired for a very short period of time. So think of like Christmas holiday or summer break. Maybe you're a camp counselor, so you're a temporary worker. They might be hired by the organization, or they may go through a temp agency for that organization. Contract employees are hired by the organization to do a very specific job, but they're not employed by the organization long term. So they may be brought in for a project, a special project, or an event. Typically, these are considered like consultants, so they may have their own business or be self-employed, and then they come in and work for a set period of time to complete a task for that organization. Compensation, or essentially how you get paid. There is a distinction made between hourly and non-hourly or salaried employees. They're often termed non-exempt or exempt. So non-exempt are hourly, salaried are exempt workers. So hourly workers are paid for each hour they work. And in salary, they're paid for doing a job. Doesn't really matter necessarily how many hours a week that they work. So they could go from, working I don't know, 20 hours a week to 80 hours a week, depending on what it takes to get the job done. They don't get paid based on the number of hours that they've worked, and they don't get overtime. They just get a set amount of pay per year. Hourly workers are paid at least a minimum wage set by the government, but the states, individual states, they could have different minimum hourly rates. When that occurs, the higher rate does prevail. So there is a link here on, you can look up what the minimum wage is in your local state, as well as what the national minimum wage level is. And an hourly rate for a worker is known as their base rate. As far as how you keep track of time for those exempt or non-exempt employees, employers can keep a record of hours using like a tracking system like this time clock that they show here on the screen. You can have timesheets that you keep on an Excel sheet. It really does vary depending on the organization. Differential wages, there are changes to the base rate, which can be made for a variety of reasons, such as overtime or working holidays. So a lot of times people get paid time and a half. That's what that means. So they get paid their base rate plus half of that. If they're performing exceptionally difficult work, if they're working in another or as another job classification, you might even get additional payments who don't receive benefits like medical or health benefits. So there's more information in your textbook about the list of differential wages and how those function. So calculation of differential wages for overtime for an employee who worked 40 hours at a base rate of $12 an hour and 5 hours of overtime is shown in the screen here. Okay, so it shows your base salary of $480, overtime rate where they essentially earned $18 per hour, that overtime rate, how much they worked for overtime pay, so they worked 5 hours, which equated $90. And so that 480 base plus the 90 that they worked overtime gave them the gross pay of $570 for the week. Salaried workers, as mentioned before, are paid a salary for doing the job. Usually their wages are higher than an hourly employee, but they're not entitled to differential wages or overtime, things of that nature. They might be entitled to compensatory time off if they work overtime. Not always, though. It depends on the organization. And sometimes salaried employees are on call, which basically means they're available at any time during unscheduled hours, such as a Saturday or Sunday if they don't normally work on those days. Salaried workers who usually work long hours, as you can imagine, are subject to burnout, which might lead to attrition or loss of employees. Essentially, burnout's that stress, that's just too much working long hours, being tired, not feeling that you're valued as an employee, which then leads to people leaving their job or attrition. All right, let's talk a little bit about how full-time equivalents work, or FTEs. This is a standard term used to describe the number of full-time positions worked by all employees, including full, part, and short hour, as well as casual hour employees. It usually equals to 40 hours per week or 2,080 hours per year. So for organizations that schedule a 40-hour work week, the annual hours that's worked, as mentioned, is 2080. You can see how they did that math there. And to compute the annual base salary for an hourly worker, you'll multiply the base salary times 2080, and that gives you what they would make per year. To compute the hourly wage, you would just do the opposite and divide that annual salary by 2080, and you would get the hourly rate. What you see there is 43,000 divided by 2080 equals $20.67 per hour. So in an organization with all full-time numbers, or full-time workers, excuse me, the number of FTEs is equal to the number of employees. But that's not the case for every organization, because there's lots of organizations, particularly food service, that have those part-time or short hour workers. And so the number of FTEs will be less. So sometimes you'll even see it as, 14.5, half of an FTE, okay? Just depends on the organization. So why do we care about this? Well, FTEs are helpful to calculate because they can be used to determine the following, such as amount of people you need to get the job done. It helps you prepare budgets, which is a crucial aspect in management, and we'll talk more about that later in the semester. It does help monitor productivity and how much are you actually getting done with the amount of employees that you have. Do you have enough? Do you not have enough? And it helps to monitor any kind of change or impact of that change that may have been implemented. Sometimes it's hard to tell initially, but FTE calculating those can sometimes help you monitor how well that change is going. So how do you figure this out? Okay, well, this is an example for you, and that's a lot of numbers on the screen. I get it. So take a minute to digest what all of this is, but it's essentially telling you this has 38 employees working in different schedules. And you'll notice there's a lot of different hours that these employees are working. You have some full-time. So it shows 22 full-time employees working 40 hours a week, right? That equals 880 hours. And then you have some 30-hour a week or part-time employees. You have 8 of those. So 8 times 30, so you have 240 hours of work that's being done by those 8 employees. Then you have 4 half-time employees, which is about 20 hours a week. So they generate about 80 hours worth of work. And then you have 4 16-hour employees, and they generate about 64 hours of work. So you add all of those hours up and you get 1,264 hours per week that's generated. And you divide that by what's considered a full-time week, which is 40 hours. And that's how you figure out, all right, you have 31.6 full-time equivalents. You'll notice that 0.6 because you have quite a few non-full-time employees. So it ends up being a part of a full-time equivalent. Okay, be familiar with how this is calculated. You will be required to do this on an exam. So review this a couple times. You might want to play around with some numbers. There are some example exercises in this module to help you practice this. All right, we're going to shift a little bit and move into diversity. So diversity is an organization's workforce. That really should reflect the community in which it exists, i.e. its customers. So refers to the ethnic, racial, gender, age, and other differences amongst workers. So a culturally diverse organization has a workforce made up of a lot of different cultural groups. And that multicultural organization values, encourages, and affirms diverse cultural modes, really where it looks at each viewpoint as valid and contributes really to the decision-making process of the organization. There is a bit of changing demographics right now. So gender, the number of women in the workforce is definitely increasing as the years have progressed. Age, it's projected that older individuals will continue to work longer than before. And Gen Z, so those digital natives, so those individuals who have always had the internet since they could remember, are beginning to enter the workforce. And then you have culture. The number of immigrants and non-whites in the workforce is definitely growing as well. Differences in physical abilities included in this, and so we have the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 that mandates accommodations be made for these employees. There is a link here that you can click into and read more about this specific Act of 1990. Also, the EEOC and affirmative action, so the equal opportunity of the U.S., is a U.S. federal law that prohibits discrimination against certain groups, such as women or minorities, in the workforce. And again, here's another link to find out more information about that. And affirmative action requires giving hiring preferences to previously disenfranchised workers. So what's some benefits of diversity within the workplace? Well, obviously a larger work pool with diverse experiences increases diversity of customers, creates a beneficial environment for everybody, for all workers, and increased ability to satisfy diverse customers that they're serving. Some drawbacks of diversity: overcoming xenophobia for some employees, or the fear of strangers or foreigners, can be challenging for some individuals. This sometimes can create employee conflicts with new staff that are brought in. There might be a perception of preferential treatment, that they were hired for one reason or another over the current employees. So sometimes that can cause conflict if not addressed by management. So really, what's the goal? The goal of workplace diversity is to provide a work environment which really everyone's contributing to the organization. It's compliance versus commitment, and it's important to have and encourage diversity training within the workplace. And I think a lot of organizations have embraced that over the years and have diversity training embedded into their training requirements.